but we're in.
Why is that?
So we'll have to talk about the weather later.
What's that? Oh, there's no fucking.
So let's see. The midterm will be up right after class on the website. Otherwise, I have it physically here, and I'll just get through the things you need to know, assuming they haven't been covered yet, and many of them have not. So this deals with the practice and practitioners, and assuming you read Rasmussen. I like to go. What I'll be covering is not necessarily covered from her particular framework, but still relevant. When I talk about, have I defined the word praxis for you? Nope. Praxis, not the Klingon moon, for you trekkers. Praxis is the intersection between theory and practice. And they change each other. You want them to change each other. So for example, when I say the field changes every 6 months, the basic biology of the human body doesn't necessarily change, but our understanding of it does. And there are certain things like drug trends that shift all the time according to economics and things like that are independent of what we often deal with within the field, because how do you keep track of things like that? So yeah, praxis, so where the theory lags behind practice, you basically want to have them meeting in a place so that you're at least doing things that are up to date, but as the field changes, you could still remain relevant, whatever relevant means. So the praxis of practitioners goes somewhat like this. You know, I always ask people when they say they want to get into this field, you sure you want to do this? So while, for example, an estimated 90% of practitioners in the addiction field are recovering, many are not. So the basic bottom line, you have to resolve your issues with addictions without necessarily getting triggered by the people you're seeing, or, for lack of a better word, freak out by the people you're seeing, because essentially we're hearing horrific stories. If you came from a horrific story, you can't necessarily project your horrific story on somebody else that didn't have as heavy a time, or make light of somebody suffering. You basically want to be able to assist them without getting too heavily engaged. So you have to resolve your issues with addictions, including, it's okay to have opinions, but not necessarily have your opinion drive someone in a way that could use help. Okay? So not to be addicted to the things, or in at least the ways that your clients are. So yeah, I'm a coffee addict, but I don't have to knock over a 7-Eleven or rob a Starbucks. But I also, kind of set boundaries, maybe 2 a day. Regular coffee, 12 ounce. It's bad when I have to do double espressos to begin the day and end the day. I haven't been at that place for a long time. So hydrating, exercising helps more. So continually working to improve yourself and to be free, as it were. So you have to be imaginative enough and knowledgeable enough to guide them through what they're going through, but not necessarily have to have gone through it yourself. In fact, one of the things that, in terms of research psychology, they find out is that most people don't necessarily have to have had the same experience to be able to talk people out of that experience. That's there's a technical term that I'm blanking on now. but I'll come back to it because it was in a TED Talk. In fact, if you look up TEDxUOregon.com, there is a research psychologist that actually did a talk about people and their expectations and stereotypes and how you can help people, So, you have to be imaginative enough and knowledgeable enough about what they're going through to guide them through what they're going through, and involved enough to be compassionate and detached enough to be effective. Courageous enough to go where they need to go, and also to be able, if you produce an emotional reaction in them, to basically stay compassionate enough so that, okay, I'm feeling you, but I'm not going to be outraged by what you're telling me. In the beginning of my career, I was dealing with a lot of people that were sexually abused, and I found that I was enraged, not at them, but at the situations, particularly when people are getting away with it, people in authority. And so, wait, I can't engage with that, I need to help this person, right? But it is useful I'm getting enraged by this, which is not to say that I don't get enraged by it now, but I'm still more directive. All right? So, but you still need to ask the question. So, courageous enough to go where they need to go, and you can't teach what you don't know. You can't lead where you don't go. So, go there, particularly if they need to go there. And they may or may not tell you if they need to go there verbally, but you will, by talking about it, by raising it as an issue, you give them permission to talk about it more. Yes?
So if you were in a session and they were looking for something that triggered you because of your past, what would you do? Just excuse yourself from the session, or how would you handle that?
You often can't do that. In fact, part of the assumption of being professional is you recognize that that's happening. And, what I do, because you asked me, is, okay, I lengthen my breathing so that I'm in a calm enough space to, okay, this is not what they're going through, this is what I went through. Oh, look at this, a reservoir of anger and rage. I got to make sure that I don't project that on them. So remain calm, and the breath allows you to do that. So whatever centering technique that, because I also teach people a lot of centering techniques as well. It's part of that. So go there. Now, when talk about what Rasmussen didn't really, she basically gave an industry standard view in terms of the praxis of practitioners. And so when I talk about social constructs of addiction, the idea here is just like anything that we take to be true, that might change. The truth might change. The science changes. So as an example, I've from time to time, I watch media and I see these drug things on television, and from time to time people, produce television shows and, talking about various, epidemics, and my reaction is often, okay, we've been having this epidemic for 15 years. Why the attention to it now, and who are you concerned about? Because I'm more concerned, and I put this out. I'm more concerned with the people that aren't getting help regularly than the people that you may be concerned about, who have plenty of help. And they're doing pretty outrageous things, but they can be helped by it. I mean, they've got resources. I'm interested in the people that don't get resources. that have the same problem that your television show is not even addressing. So, social constructs of addiction. They're constructs or memes of addiction which then give rise to solutions and social policy. Or not. So, there's a word, enantiodromia, which literally means that which arises from its opposite. It's a Greek word. New word to spring on your friends. And this is the word, if it's in the dictionary, I usually preview dictionaries before I buy them. If this word is in the dictionary, I'll buy it. Not that I'm in the habit of buying dictionaries, but. So, in street talk, the idea of enantiodromia. Problems create solutions. Then, the solution to the problem creates new problems, which then need further solutions, and it basically becomes not only a self-fulfilling prophecy, but a loop.
Sounds like medication, isn't it?
Yeah. The cure to the disease is in the disease. Right? That which arises from its opposite. And the way in which you see the problem is the problem. Now, looking at an evolution of how this country in particular has looked at addictions as a problem, kind of informs what we do today. And so I'm just going to kind of take you through that. So this is part of the setup. So in enantiodromia, problems create solutions. Solution to the problem create new problems, which then find new solutions which create new problems. The cure to the disease is in the disease, and the way that you see the problem is the problem. So example with C. If somebody's abusing painkillers, the issue is how you're dealing with pain. Is it physical pain or emotional pain? If it's emotional pain, the drug is numbing your response to your own emotions. That's the problem. The addiction is then the symptom of the problem. The addiction has become the solution to the problem of you weren't taught how to deal with your emotions, so you're self-medicating yourself. Your emotions continue to not be resolved, but now you've got a new problem, is that you're physically strung out on a drug, which is going to have other consequences to you, right? So, cure to the disease is, okay, if your thing is pain, heal the pain properly. That means you have to be sober enough to actually be in to look at it. That's difficult. It's like, for example, dealing with a student who, a lot of our students are in this position where you're coming to college as the first person in your family that ever came to college, and you're a high school dropout, and that was more than a decade ago. Okay? So, for example, if you're training for a field which requires a foreign language, and you're having problems with the foreign language because if you don't know what a verb or a noun or an adjective is in English, learning what that is in Spanish ain't gonna help you. You have to go back and do the work that theoretically people got in not only 3rd and 4th grade, but in high school. Remember diagramming those sentences? Oh, well, that's why I dropped out. It's a quote. Yeah, okay. This is why you're having the problem. So a Spanish tutor ain't going to be able to help you with that because you can't diagram a sentence in Spanish, so you don't know because you don't have that skill in English, as an example. And so blowing up at the Spanish tutor is not going to endear you to people. The problem isn't necessarily in them. It's in your history, and especially if your emotions are tied up to what has happened to you, and you're medicating that, so these problems get tied in. All right, so 5 cultural ways of seeing addictions. And the reason I say cultural is because Rasmussen and others basically take the way that we look at the treatment field as not necessarily being a cultural view. For her, it's the normal view. And one of the things that we've been finding in treatment is that normal isn't normal for everybody in the same way. So, first, addiction as sin. Willful misbehavior. So, if your view is addiction as sin, and sin is willful misbehavior, and sin is a religious term, notice that, right? So the solution is to punish the addict. And this gives you a simple binary. Oh, you're willfully doing wrong, throw you behind in jail. Addiction as disease. Then the solution is treat the addict with 12-step based treatment using the disease model. And addiction as maladaptive behavior. And the solution is treat and teach the addict pro-social adaptive behaviors and skills, which in this particular approach means cognitive behavioral therapy, multi-systemic therapy, evidence-based practice, and all that. Now, this has been the treatment world up until relatively recently, say, for example, the last 20 years. The 12-step framework was invented in the late 30s, became the dominant mode of treatment after alcoholism was named as a disease in 1956. The solution became 12-step based treatment, 90 meetings in 90 days, etc. And then the scientists started getting into addiction as maladaptive behavior construct, and I think more or less that's where Rasmussen stops, though she acknowledges that culture is a dimension, and we've already kind of gone through. You know where my thoughts are on that, so we'll get to that in a bit. So cognitive behavioral therapy, multi-systemic therapy, individual, family, and social learning therapies. So for example, with the first one, addiction is sin, willful misbehavior. It's the basic policy from colonial times to 1956, punish the addict. Give them electroshock therapy, sterilize them, drop them into ice baths, lobotomies. Not making this up. That was treatment for alcoholism before 56. Huh?
And gambling.
And gambling, sure. Drug them, all kinds of things. Addiction is disease. Okay, so when the American Medical Association said alcoholism is a disease in 56, essentially is treating the addict with 12-step based treatment, basically with that framework includes higher power, having a sponsor, doing step work, the traditions, the idea of 90 meetings in 90 days, being the course of therapy. Now, one of the challenges with this view to the science folks is how many doses of higher power do you need, and where is the higher power? So if you look at the construct of what a disease is within the framework of medicine, diseases, like I showed you with the public health model, diseases are caused by something. Malaria is caused by bacteria. It's vectored by a mosquito. So there's a definite agent. What's the agent in alcoholism? The liquor store? And if this was like a disease, okay, like cancer is definitely a disease, right? So you have cancer cells and you remove the cancer and, okay, it's gone, or you treat it with chemo and it's gone. But then if the person has a relapse of cancer, do you blame the person for relapsing cancer? Okay, so do we blame people for having relapses on substances? Yes, we do. So this is a disease that is different than we treat differently in a policy way, and also in terms of our thought processes than other diseases. Okay, so the medical community goes, okay, we're into like science. So show me higher power. How many doses of higher power do you need to produce a lasting effect? Oh, you can't tell me that? I ain't buying it. Here's what I am going to buy. This is the science community speaking, right? All right? Maladaptive behavior. That's the language that they're talking about. Mal means bad, adaptive behavior. What you are doing is using a coping skill that's not the best one to use because it's ultimately damaging. That's from that framework, right? Science is the thing with this framework. What's God got to do with it? I'm sorry, that's quasi-religious. How much God do you need at a AA meeting to produce a lasting effect? See, the scientists ask questions like that, and when you can't answer them, with facts and figures and quantifiable data, right? Evidence-based practices, they're uncomfortable. All right, so solution, treat and teach the addict pro-social adaptive behaviors to replace the maladaptive behaviors that they developed, to get them to understand what they're going through. So part of this approach you've been getting from me, and that is talking about the neuroscience. Understanding, okay, these drugs are doing things to your brain, they're replacing emotions, you're basically feeling this particular way and then self-medicating. So the language of self-medication comes out of this framework. But they only go so far. All right, so it's basically looking at addiction is sin. This is basically where we're using incarceration as treatment, or incarceration in place of treatment. Within our framework, we're part of the medical community. So treating a medical condition with prison is not effective long term, especially since you can score dope in prison. Not that they admit that, but you can. Right? So, despite the near total belief of treatment agencies in this form of disease model that's quasi-medical, the disease model is not supported by empirical data. Particularly, there are some major hypotheses that are disputed by the research crowd, the scientific crowd. For example, what I mentioned early on, THIQs. Okay, THIQ, not real, about being causative factor in addiction, not proven by the science. Okay, not a valid construct. So, the idea, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, or you are born an alcoholic, scientifically imprecise. Stanton Peele, in 1985, basically the maturing out concept, you grow out of addiction. Well, some people might. This is again within the disease concept. It's a spiritual disease or disease as metaphor. It's an object, so a metaphor is an object or idea used to symbolize something else, to make an analogy. So spiritual disease, primary disease, loss of control, powerlessness, small amount produces uncontrolled drinking. Maybe in some people, maybe not in others. Yes, we can observe this and people can report this with some regularity, but it doesn't necessarily happen with everybody, and so within the scientific view, you need to be able to explain the variances convincingly in a way that's replicable. So the strengths of the disease model is that it's simple. It proposes an alternative to the sin model, gives patients a psychological out. I'm powerless as long as I have this community of folks helping me to reinforce recovery. I work the steps, fearless in searching moral inventory, make amends, etc., etc. Okay? So, its strengths is that it's simple and proposes an alternative. And provides a global, non-using community. Let me see if I can shrink this so that it fits. Oh, compatibility mode means I can't change it. Oops. Wow, we've covered a lot of material. Feel overwhelmed sometimes.
Sometimes. I got a lot of shit on my plate, man.
Make compost.
Right? Working on it.
Got shit? Make compost.
Working on it. It's my area of opportunity.
There you go. Okay, so provides a global non-using culture. So, other weaknesses, does not examine the role of culture, learning, or environment, particularly where there's structured inequality. There are more liquor stores in your neighborhood. Drug dealers are not prosecuted in your neighborhood.
You have no idea.
Hmm?
I said you have no idea.
I bet I do.
We live at 2380 Roosevelt.
Ah,
This is bad. That's where I met him. He used to be next door. He was, this was horrible. There was like one right next to me, one on the other side of me, and one right up above me.
You know you're being recorded, right?
That's okay.
Okay, all right.
I hope they heard it. That's an anonymous report.
Hey, I don't want you targeted, so good thing. They can't see that. So, the effectiveness in general is generally poor as judged by high relapse rates. So if you had those same relapse rates with any other disease, you'd question the treatment. So, does not adequately explain compulsive substance use, and does not address current or historical trauma issues in various populations. I mean, I have been in the field long enough to observe the fight for women to get women's only treatment, particularly where women could have their kids go into treatment with them. That was a fight. Male practitioners couldn't see the need. Why do you want to do that? Heard of domestic violence? There's lots of reasons why you would do that. Just because Bill W. didn't want to do it, look, the field is evolving. So yeah, finally we've have women's treatment as a standard feature, but that wasn't always the case. So, maladaptive or evidence-based. Now, the thing with evidence-based in the scientific community, evidence-based means that some government or university has paid for the research to be done and then replicated it or had it replicated. Now, do they fund everything? So research is essentially consists of asking questions. If it never occurs to you to ask the question, will you do research on it? No. You think they ask questions about everything that addicts and alcoholics and people in recovery go through? No. So, maladaptive behavior, literally bad maladaptation or bad adaptation. Sure, it works, but something else would work better, like, in my opinion, consciousness. So, you didn't learn pro-social skills, so where do you learn pro-social skills? My commentary about not from Prozac, my whole thing about pills are not skills. You can't just medicate a problem. The drug won't make it go away. You actually need a skill set. And that was the original theory before the influence of Big Pharma, where we did teach people psychological skills and we only gave them pills for the immediate rough patch, assuming the rough patch lasted 3 weeks. You know, say you have one of the 5 major stressors, somebody dies or you get married or whatever. Let's take death. Don't want to equate marriage with death. But say you have a death, okay? You have the initial shock, you have the funeral, all that whole process. Maybe you need Prozac for that 3-week period and process your grief. You don't want to be necessarily medicated. You want to process your grief, right? So then you have counseling. This was assuming that you had a middle class, income and could afford therapy, right? Where therapy was available, right? So, but therapists are expensive because they have to pay for their training, etc. So pills became cheaper. Yes?
But doesn't it take 2 weeks for Prozac to get into your system and become effective?
Well, sure. Actually, less than a week, but yeah. You might be thinking of lithium. The lithium takes a while to build up to the right level. Prozac might be faster. So, for example, there are various theories, right? So, just to use one, Wormser's. 2 general conditions in developing compulsive substance use. The addictive search, that is, you're seeking external relief from overpowering internal drives. These are emotions. Something is missing, or it feels like something is missing. You don't know what it is, so you fill the empty space, if there is an empty space, with substances, because that's what everybody else is doing. And that's what you have name familiarity with. Oh, what's this spice stuff? Here, let me try it. Tastes like blueberries. Okay, why? But, yeah.
Huffing was big when I was in high school.
Caffeine?
Huffing? No.
Huffing, yes.
Yeah,
Huffing, yes, right.
Aerosol. And I was just like, you're doing what?
Right,
Why?
yeah.
Like,
Yeah, huffing Glade is like a 5-minute acid trip.
yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Why would you? Okay, right. So, 2 things. So, 1, the addictive search, and 2, the adventitious entrance of chemicals. Adventitious means that the chemicals are arriving. They're added from an outside and often unexpected source, rather than intrinsic, rather than being in the environment. So you're looking for something, you're looking for a solution or an answer, someone brings in chemicals, some chemical, and off you go. and developing, for example, adventitious also means developing in an unusual position. For example, a root growing downward from a branch. There are some trees that actually do that, but if you use this metaphor as basically, how does an addiction evolve in a person who didn't have addictions in their family, but did move into an addictive environment? Seems like it's added on unexpectedly from a different direction. So, within this framework, compulsive drug use is an attempt at self-treatment. That's where the language of self-medication comes from. So, narcotics and hypnotics, sedative hypnotics, like alcohol, benzodiazepines, counter rage, shame, jealousy, anxiety. Stimulants, depression and feelings of weakness. Psychedelics, boredom and disillusionment. Alcohol, guilt, loneliness, and related anxiety. So, for example, Kantian, Halliday, McAuliffe, alcohol, opiate, or cocaine addicts are victims of traumatic abuse and violence, using those substances to self-medicate that. The resulting rage, that is, a certain extreme intensity of anger at being abused, lower levels of anger and aggression are treated with opiates and cocaine.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If somebody mixes benzodiazepines with methadone.
Benzodiazepines
Benzodiazepines.
with opiates?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can it cause them to hallucinate? Or while they're on those?
Yeah. Haven't heard that. It's not impossible. As an example, when people did opium, when they smoked opium, one of the draws for smoking opium is that you would see visions. You would see things. Right? So, not per se is it a hallucinogen, but it can cause certain hypnagogic states.
Didn't it used to be the artist drug?
One of the artist drugs, yes. As well as absinthe.
Yeah, absence the one I'm thinking.
Yeah, absinthe. So, sedative hypnotics, including alcohol, are abused by those who are anxious and inhibited. The drugs are used to overcome defenses and fears about intimacy. The drugs dissolve the defenses. Without them, people feel lonely or isolated from others, and sometimes drugs in this particular class, particularly like alcohol, are actually used socially to relieve social anxiety. I mean, that's what people mostly say, that they drink in social situations if they're going to. But what they tend to do, of course, is overdrink. So, similar theories can be created for other drugs of abuse. Rasmussen talks about some of them. So, just to introduce you to the concept that, research has been done about why people use particular classes of drugs. You could actually even associate certain drug states with certain emotional states and read backwards into, if the person is taking this drug, these are the feelings they use to cover up, or these are the feelings they are using that are being generated as a result of the drug, and proceed there in therapy. Right, so certain psychedelic drugs, LSD, ecstasy, mescaline, ketamine, yahe, ibogaine, often used to induce or simulate or access certain spiritual states. Now, the only reason I'm calling it a spiritual state is because when we have essentially a non-ordinary reality, that you're trying to get to on a regular basis for whatever reason. Some of these states are also achievable using certain spiritual technologies. So it could be fasting, could be doing a number of things that that induce states similar to these particular substances. But Americans are really into quickness and convenience, so they'll do drugs rather than fast for 40 days and nights in a desert.
I want to mention a state that I occasionally get into, and it can be drug induced, and that's where I feel a second or two behind of everything else. Like I know what's going to happen. It's surreal. Sort of.
Second ahead or second behind?
It could be either.
Okay.
When you're a second behind, everything's happening too fast.
Mhm.
When you're a second ahead, everything's happening too slow.
Mm-hmm.
I can do that on my own
Yeah, with nothing.
with nothing.
Yeah. Yes. Time is a perception. It happens.
But I also want that can be induced.
Yes,
as well.
it can be induced. Continuing with maladaptive behavior, cocaine addicts are thought to select cocaine for relief from depression, boredom, or emptiness. Cocaine bolsters feelings of self-esteem and assertiveness. Definitely an ego type of drug. There is a concept in psychology called concretization. So if I could, for example, underneath the paint of this supporting wall, concrete is what color?
Right.
Gray. All right, and with the exception of like these things here, which are clearly rocks, close, and you can see that they're rocks. Concretization, what the concept is that you can't see into this, right? And so what this stage is, it's a stage of, it's considered an emotion. Clients are not able to articulate their feelings, and their feelings are set. But what concrete is a conglomerate. So there's rocks, there's sand, and there's stuff holding it together in a matrix, as well as water. So they're not able to see the separate parts. So concretization, clients do not articulate their feelings. So this is considered normal for children and young adolescents as a developmental stage until they can articulate what they're feeling. But because, at least in a couple of theoretical frameworks and experiential frameworks, there is an emotional arrest, that is, your emotional development stops or is slowed by drug use. So you're not necessarily able to be in touch with certain feelings. Or when you stop using, you're basically starting your emotional growth at the point that you started, which basically means you could have a 40-year-old that's still 9 emotionally, or a teenager. So concretization is considered a normal stage for children and young adults until they are able to articulate and identify their feelings. So in chemically dependent adults, considered developmental lag. So the idea is, you start using, the lag begins, stop using, you start developing emotionally from that point. How fast you develop basically is dependent on how much introspective and other emotional work you're willing to do. So, maladaptive behavior. So, while this worldview gives you great descriptions, it's not so great on how to implement personal, practical, transformative solutions. Now, from the point of view that I'm talking about coming from this place, it's saying that you have a set of circumstances that you've arrived at as a result of trying to implement solutions that weren't necessarily working, but they were the solutions that everybody else was doing. How do you change from that person into something that is more difficult to imagine? Like a lot of people can't imagine not using friends. What do you mean I'm never going to use again for the rest of my life? And certainly in adolescent treatment, one of the things, okay, if you're adolescent and now, well, I had a serious addiction I'm never going to use for the rest of my life, and I'm seriously considering that at 16, what do you know at 16? I'm going to be able to actually go through college and not participate in the party? Is a 16-year-old really capable of making that decision and sticking to it? Probably not. What about a 40-year-old who's 16 emotionally? Okay, so in one sense, from this point of view, it's basically acknowledging, okay, there's been a developmental lag, so relapse is probably going to be predictable. It's probably going to be predictable, so there's not any point in actually guilt tripping somebody. Guilt is not a very good motivator. So, a question that could be asked from this point of view is, what are the emotional skills I need to explore my pain without being in the middle of my pain? Or being in the middle of my pain and still being able to explore it. What is this pain? Where is it coming from? I asked somebody, where is your anchor? What do you mean? Where do you feel it? Well, in my head. But they also kept rubbing their stomach and they got ulcers. Okay, it's also in your belly. Oh, that's psychological. No, it's not. Every time you express being angry, you grabbed at your stomach. So there's a connection there. Where are you feeling the anger in your body? And then what do you do about it? So what are the emotional skills I need to explore my pain? How do I get relief from stress and trauma in a pro-social way? How do I do that? So that's what maladaptive behavior concerns itself with, and usually what happens in this worldview is basically this is where people get medicated instead of necessarily getting emotional or counseling skill. Now, like I said before, the theory was that you get the emotional skill building and the pill is just for the rough patch, but now what we do as a matter of policy is medicate. With or without skill building, usually without. Because the people who are medicating, talk about my dad, and basically, he's a psychiatrist, and when he was trained, it was psychiatrists that were the main ones giving emotional skill, but essentially insurance now only pays for a 15-minute session per patient, and then packing in more patients. So you don't have time to go into somebody's emotional life. All you can do is med management in 15 minutes.
Think about it.
Right.
So there's some reflection done by the doctor.
There might be, but you might not have time for that within the session that you're allowed, that the state will pay for. So he's working, for a state clinic.
I'm just saying, a lot of these subjects are awfully deep.
Mm-hmm.
And even from the mind of the professional, he has to think about it a little.
Yes, right.
Look at you and study you.
Yes, it's true. And they may or may not have time to do that, depending on the setting. You may or may not be able to do that in a Dewey group, as an example. Well, why am I on my second DUI? Okay, and I'm mad because I have to come here. Okay, well, why are you on your second or third DUI? Wasn't the first one enough to give you the message? Well, no, I need treatment. Okay, part of treatment is not using and looking at the stuff that's driving you to drink, not just drinking and driving. How do you get relief from stress and trauma? So, in the 5 cultural views, 2 non-Western views, Addiction is life out of balance. The Hopi word for this is koyaanisqatsi. Just decided to use this particular word. So within the Wellbriety movement, the Wellbriety movement is not just populated by Hopi people, but this is a great word because there are actually 13 different translations of this word into English, and I've only given you first 5 that relate to addiction. So koyaanisqatsi, crazy life, a life in turmoil, life disintegrating, life out of balance, a state of life that calls for another way of living. So if the view is addiction is life out of balance, or addiction occurs in a life that's out of balance, if that's the problem, then the solution is living in balance. Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
So in a native way, basically you have to go to the emotions first. You have to heal the emotions first, as far back as they go. And this is the worldview where we get multi-generational trauma. That is, you might be experiencing the pain of your people even though you didn't personally experience it. It's being transmitted along the gene lines. So emotional healing of multi-generational trauma, and then cultural practices that restore spiritual balance and right relationships. So for example, within Indian country, we talk about there is a sacred use of tobacco, so tobacco as a sacrament versus tobacco as an addiction. So there's an addictive use of tobacco and a sacred use of tobacco, and they're not the same pattern at all. So in the original native use of tobacco, actually, that particular herb was called many things, and tobacco was a pipe. There was just a mistranslation with white people. So the pipe got called the herb, whatever. Anyway, we're stuck with what we were stuck with. So the idea with the original herb is you don't inhale it. You don't bring it into your lungs. Basically, it's representing visible breath, visible prayer, and you're sending the prayers out. So you're inhaling only in your mouth and exhaling the prayer. And you ain't praying every 5 minutes. Right? So you don't get the addiction syndrome in the sacred pipe. Basically, you're sharing breath. That is a ritual way of sharing breath. Versus tobacco as addiction, where you do inhale, you have the whole acetylcholine nicotine reaction and addictive syndrome. TP meetings. The TP are medicine meetings. So TP meetings, these are peyote. They're often used as a treatment adjunct within the Native American church for overcoming addictions, particularly with alcohol, where basically if you look at the recovery frameworks that use this particular model, basically the problem is seen as the indigenous pre-contact way of life became out of balance and got disrupted by essentially becoming American. And so part of healing is learning a life out of balance and a life that's more in balance and more in line with the traditional sustainable lifestyle. TP meetings, so the idea also within the framework of the substance we call by its Spanish name marijuana, the little smoke, it's a powerful psychoactive plant ally that can show you vision, but if you use it too much, it clouds your vision. So within this framework, they're having the idea that it's also about having a balance where you basically use it periodically as an ally for vision, but you use it too much, it clouds your vision. So if you use it like countercultural Prozac, so I've known people that feel marijuana is a study aid for them. maybe they're able to process on it. They're using, well, school is stressing me out, this calms my stress. Yeah, okay, how are you doing on tests with that? Are you remembering the material? If you can, fine, but I wouldn't recommend that as a strategy. So, Little Smoke as ally versus countercultural Prozac. And then 5, addiction as weapon. Addiction to legal and illegal drugs is profitable. Also, addiction is slavery. It's an African American construct. So if that is the way you see the problem, then solutions, active, spiritually based, this is not the same as religiosity, but it could be. Active, spiritually based resistance against the ism-based cultures which promote addiction, codependency, promote cultural, historical, spiritual, and interpersonal knowledge, skills, and abilities which develop self-sufficiency, interdependency, cultural proficiency, economic and political independence. So in this framework, recovery is not just not using the substance. Recovery is also becoming culturally and politically viable and aware. They go hand in hand. Because the idea of, well, certainly you see my particular framework and point of view, it's like, okay, you've got to look at everything. It's like the drug dealers are running the country. So if the drug dealers are running the country, what does recovery look like? If drug dealers were running the country, then recovery would be illegal, and you would still have to be effective. What if you acted like it is, and they are? What would recovery look like? So, as an example, within this framework, so addiction as a weapon. So there have basically, addictions have been used and addictive substances have been used, deliberately used as powerful for profit regardless of its effect on others. So for example, in chattel slavery, so when we say addiction is slavery, so addiction is basically kept in place by the same forces that kept slavery in place. Slavery is kept in place because it was profitable. So for example, the average profit that you got on the lifetime of, over the lifetime of a slave, if you paid $800 for a slave in $1850, you would be basically making $1.3 million on the life, not on the life of that slave, but on the labor that that slave produced. So if there's 4 to 10 million slaves, you do the math on that.
What was the number again?
1,500% profit per slave. So if you bought a slave at $800, you could make 1.3 million over the life of that slave. More if the slave is female, because you're making money off the kids, not just the labor. So the idea in African American culture when we're talking about addiction is slavery, okay, slavery was basically legal and supported. And we're also saying addiction is legal and supported by some of the same forces. So that is, people are property. People have relative value, relative worth, and leads to the concept that people have economic value and worth, and some people have more value or worth than others. So the people of higher value control the people of lower value and can do whatever they want as long as it creates wealth for the people of higher value. So for example, then, right, if 80% of the illegal drug users in America are white men who make in excess of $50,000, and they're not the ones that are going to jail, then who's going to jail? The 3% of the drug user, 3% of the illegal drug users? Or 7% of the illegal drug users
Wow.
that are minorities? Or that are selling to the white men? So as an example, within this framework, when we talk about the prison industrial complex, okay, if the drug war is putting more people in prison, actually there are, for example, more African Americans in prison today for drug offenses than were in slavery in 1850. Right? So, for non-violent drug offenses. So, incarceration is not treatment. It's not necessarily a solution. So, allowing essentially people using drugs as a form of social control. So, treatment has to either address that or address the effects of it, or at least acknowledge that those effects exist. So, basic value from slavery, which is you can rape a human woman. Your values say that she isn't human, but biologically she is, of course. Get her pregnant, then sell her kid, your kid, for a profit, and not feel anything is wrong. So even if you didn't own slaves, there was a benefit from slavery existing, because generally if a slave escaped, you didn't help them get free or help them escape generally. Addiction promoting practices came out of slavery. Slaves were given cocaine as an incentive to work. Slaves didn't want to drink necessarily because the overseer drank and beat them. So what little data we have on addiction patterns during slavery, slaves tended not to drink because of that example. But slaves were given cocaine to work, even in the South. So, boom, addiction to slavery, we see the connections because there's connections. I didn't even know that, wow. So, there are a number of community organization efforts that have made a connection between addiction and slavery. So, it doesn't matter whether you believe in it or choose to buy it, just understand this is a framework that people community organize around and develop treatment around. Yeah?
Where does the term chattel slavery come from?
Chattel slavery.
Oh.
Okay, chattel rhymes with cattle. So the idea chattel equals property. So you're not buying a person, you're not buying a human being, you're like buying a chair. That's the framework. They're not human, they're property.
So is that an old term that was used?
Yeah, well basically when you have, so we have slavery in America today. We have about, so there's sex slavery. Okay, so you're still property, but property used only for sex. Slaves in the South weren't they weren't just used for sex, they were used also for labor. Okay, so the idea is that they're property, or they're less than human.
Like being in the military, basically.
I wouldn't have put it like that, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but in order to be in the military, you have to be a citizen.
Yes.
Okay, so.
Of the specific.
Right. Yeah. Again, I wouldn't have put it that way, but there are parallels. Okay? I mean, the whole GI means government issue.
Yes.
Yes, you're property of the U.S. government. Okay, but you're a citizen. So while there are parallels to slavery, I'm sure many military personnel might, it's a dicey comparison to make. But I could see that.
Okay.
I've heard that analogy before.
Well, it says it right on your ID.
Yeah. You said it, I didn't. All right, so in terms of looking at treatment, we're just, again, not just looking at the substances, we're also looking at the person's place within society, how they view themselves. Because if you were in chattel slavery, okay, where you were essentially property and being worked, and then say, for example, given cocaine to induce you to work, because what cocaine does, you'll be able to perform work, but you won't, it'll suppress your appetite. So you can produce more work with less food or water, less overhead, right? Your property, and they'll just work you to death because that's what they're about doing anyway. And yeah, your property and your owner can do with you whatever they want because your property, you don't have rights. So these efforts in terms of treatment emphasize the connection between economics, addiction, institutional racism, and other forms of discrimination and social control. Generally, they promote cultural empowerment strategies, and by which part of your recovery is basically fully actualizing yourself in terms of a creative and economically viable and politically aware human being as part of your recovery. So it's not just substances, it's you need to recover your freedom and the practice of freedom. So as an example, I actually drove by this a week or so ago. This is Gallagher's, and this was in the 90s when what's now Martin Luther King Boulevard, so Gallagher's is on Martin Luther King, and so anyway, at this point in the 90s, Gallagher's was essentially a 24-hour crack supermarket, and in this particular photograph, basically what happened is the cops would bust the area every once in a while, every few months, but the dealers, of course, would be back within hours, right? So two women come in and they essentially do what's essentially graffiti, and they paint, so this is in the heart of the black community. So they painted a line of slaves. And then captioned, so a line of slaves with crack pipes in their mouths, some of them. You can barely see that here, and there. But says, crack is 20th century, cocaine is 20th century slaver. Crack, same game, new name. Same old color. Have you met your new master? Overnight. And then the morning comes, and the dealers see that, and they leave. And they never came back while that was up. It's not up now. This is the 90s. But, so, Juana, wherever she is, I know who she is. She's one of the artists. So, this technique is basically illegal graffiti. But it permanently shut down open-air crack supermarket, where numerous police sweeps did nothing. And it's basically part of the community-based treatment approach in terms of looking at, okay, recovery isn't just my personal recovery, it's also recovery in the community. So this is another piece in terms of looking at what addiction as slavery means, or addiction as a weapon. The response has to be not just you getting clean and sober individually, but also your community recovering as well. You are intimately tied into your community. Your health is the community's health, and vice versa. So even the winos said, when they saw this, that sign is saying something. So started a promotion campaign called Signs of Recovery, in which they basically used art projects in a similar way with the cooperation of business owners. So as an example, if we talked about, when I was saying early on in, I believe it was the first week, when we were talking about culturally specific treatment or culturally responsive treatment, the idea is if it's not culturally specific, it's dominant culture. That is, if it isn't specific to a particular culture, or if it doesn't mention culture, it's probably generic, which means that it's not going to meet certain people's needs. There's certainly a question whether mainstream treatment is even effective with all white people. Well, lots of people say it is not. And it's not just the God thing. There's other elements that are not as effective. So what would more culturally relevant treatment look like? So this will appear on the, has appeared on the midterm, so in case you see this, basically common stress responses to racism. It's early on in, so you don't have to search it. I basically said, okay, common stress responses. This literature mentions racism, but there is certainly other reasons for feeling anger, paranoia, anxiety, helplessness, hopelessness, frustration, resentment, and fear. But definitely within the literature, in terms of looking at PTSD or PSSD, that is post-slavery stress disorder. These are common stress responses to one form of patterned discrimination. So, since there are other patterns and other forms of discrimination, these could also be looked at as well, and these are also some of the feelings that you could explore with a client that has either been abused or been subject to other forms of isms. Let me know when you got that. Yes, got it? Okay. So, all right. So have I shown this before?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Good. A little bit more and then we'll call it a day. Because they're about to give me the 5-minute sign anyway. So treatment methodology and goals. We're just getting a little ahead here. But so given all the things that we've talked about, those views of those 5 cultural views of addiction. So when we're looking at how are we guiding people from this through, we might have a beginning, middle, and an end for treatment, and we might write that on a treatment plan. But in the day-to-day session, the process itself is the goal, and process, as counselors speak, for the entire, what's going on with a person emotionally, mentally, and physically as you're engaging in this talking cure. So recovery is a spiraling process, not a destination. So the spiral, this may look like a circle when you're viewing it downward, but the actual process is a spiral. And however you want to orient it in space, an upward spiral is going higher. A downward spiral, of course, is going down just before you crash. So recovery is a spiraling process. That is, it's circular, and you revisit certain themes over and over, but you're experiencing them at a different level than when you experienced them before, assuming the process is healthy. And what I mean by healthy is, okay, if you've identified certain problems, copy that. If you've identified certain problems, they're going to experience, for example, their anger, their grief. They'll go through cycles over and over, and as awareness is added, they will be at a different level than the time before. Right? So it's a spiral, not a circle. They're not going in circles. There is progress, even if it appears to be like a slinky. All right? So the method must instill the skills to support client-centered recovery. In other words, whatever you do, so it's not what's wrong with them, but the healing that needs to occur because of what happened to them. So not just the diagnosis, but a healing process that needs to occur because of what happened. And that's why I keep talking about, in a spiral motion, identifying the pain and healing it properly. So what will happen is you'll not experience the pain, but you'll remember it, which will be different than experiencing it. So you don't ever end in a place where you're recovered. It's a process. So, there's a physical neurochemical reasons for addiction within the brain. We might suppose that there's a natural balance created by the DNA code. That balance gets changed with exposure to chemicals or other environmental processes or pressures. And so, for example, we've looked at the hardware of the brain, and so next week we'll look at the software of the mind. So part of the software of the mind is basically looking at how we explored it today was looking at those 5 cultural views of addiction. Different frameworks. There are others. And the first 3 are the ones that were taught as mainstream addiction practice. But some of us felt that we needed to, especially with the Wellbriety movement in Indian country and the various treatment agencies like the former Black Panthers and others doing free heroin detox, they're basically saying, okay, we need to look at this in an entirely different way in terms of long-term solutions. So let me hand out the midterm. Stop here, hand out the midterm. It's due in a week. You don't have to take a week to do it. Probably better if you do your own work without sharing your wrong answers. And it'll be online in about 10 minutes. And you can turn in your biopsychosocial recons either now or over the course of, okay. So we got 1 minute now, they say.
I was gone for a couple of days.
Okay.
Did you pass back the papers?
I have not.
Okay.
I haven't.
Have they been graded yet?
They have been graded, it hasn't showed up on Moodle yet. I have to create the
Okay.
categories.
Yeah, because I looked today and it said just 0, like it said 0.
Right.
And it said no grade. Okay.
Right.
So I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't because you didn't get it.
Right. Thank you.
Oh, I need that these too. I don't need this.
Hey, look at you, DSM number